If you've ever played Resident Evil 7, you already know how terrifying it is. You know it's scary, right? But when you think back to the time you first played the game, a few parts in particular might come to mind as the scariest moments in the game. It could be when Mia climbed up the stairs on all fours before giving you quite the jump scare. It might also be the first time you try to hide from Jack Baker, who's willing to tear down any obstacle in his way just to capture you. And he doesn't even think how much drywall he has to do after. Or maybe it's every time you see Marguerite, because she's just creepy and scary always, actually. But there's one part of the game that just hits differently and fills me with so much fear and dread every time I get there. And that part is this staircase to the basement. I played through the game again recently and rediscovered just how much this basement stairway truly scares me. And as it turns out, I'm not alone in feeling this way. I went on YouTube to see what other people thought of this basement door, and I found an amazing video by Fat Brett, or Fabret, I don't know if the T's are silent, but he actually describes almost exactly how the basement door made me feel. So in this video, I want to add to Fat Brett's analysis and try to get to the bottom of why the build-up to the basement is so damn scary. But before we do all that, let's take a look at the actual basement staircase itself. I'm going to show you a clip of this section, and I want you to really try and feel the atmosphere of this space, and really soak everything in. So let's watch. So, how did that make you feel? Pretty cozy, huh? No, just kidding. It's really scary, right? And we didn't even open the door yet. But why exactly is this scene so creepy? I think first of all, the layout design is absolutely perfect. And part of what makes it so good is this striking contrast between the warm and comforting mood of the save room and the cold and unknown basement corridor that's right next to it. And I think that having the save room right here also does a great job of subtly alerting the player that you're about to enter a really horrifying and unforgiving area. So you might want to save here, you little gamer. And I think this is actually a really powerful game design choice to really imprint the potential danger in the player's mind. And speaking of potential danger, the spatial and sound design is really crucial in adding to the tension of this scene. You have this dark, empty hallway to your immediate right that, by itself, is already incredibly unnerving with how still and quiet it is. It really has no business being this scary, honestly. And on top of that, there's a seemingly open window behind a closed curtain right behind you that gives off a really unsettling windy sound. So it's basically dead quiet, other than the howling wind ambiance, Ethan's mouth breathing, and the occasional sharp creaking sound that never fails to creep me out. And even though the corridor and stairway are really narrow, structurally speaking, this clever design actually makes you feel like you're surrounded and vulnerable, almost naked. Like you have no idea where a new potential threat may come from. Is something going to grab me from the right side of the hallway as soon as I try to go down the stairs? Is Jack Baker going to suddenly barrel through the window and chase me down to the basement? Who knows? But what exactly sets this basement apart from other creepy moments of RE7? There's actually another part of the game that made me feel almost the exact same way, albeit to a lesser degree, and that was at the very beginning of the game when you first go into the guest house. I got the same sinking feeling of panic and dread when I went from this outside, open and illuminated area to a suddenly dark and claustrophobic entrance corridor that locks behind you. This initial contrast is very jarring and makes you kind of think that, okay, now we're in a horror game. But still, what makes the basement stairwell feel so different? Why does it hit so much harder? The short answer is, because it's a basement, duh. But why exactly are basements so scary to begin with? And it turns out there's quite a few cultural and psychological factors that make us naturally more fearful of basements. As you're probably well aware already, the sheer amount of horror media that show basements as scary places definitely contributes to this cultural fear of basements, since they're usually, or almost always, a space where something bad happens. You can probably pick a scary movie randomly out of a hat, and odds are there's a scene or two with a creepy basement. Some psychologists suggest that this fear also stems from the fact that basements are kinda hidden or tucked away from the rest of the home, even though they're part of the house, and you typically don't spend too much time down there. We just kinda go in and out since they're not really living spaces. Even me, as someone who spent part of their life growing up in a basement, you could say I was molded by it, I still don't feel very comfortable anytime I go to another basement that I'm not familiar with. And if you grew up without a basement in your home, you probably feel that much more uncomfortable when you do come across one. And something that makes this basement in the Baker home feel even more unsettling and uncanny is the fact that southern states like Louisiana almost never have a basement. And this is due to the very damp soil and shallow water table in the region, especially deep in the bayou area, where the fictional Dulvey Parish is supposed to be located. In other words, the fact that this basement isn't really supposed to be here makes it all the more creepy in retrospect. But I admit, I was definitely not aware of this, or even really thought about it when I first played the game. I was just like, damn, that's a creepy ass basement. But if you grew up in the South in the US, maybe you're more conscious of this area not being possible, and therefore more creepy and unnerving. But something I was conscious of when I first came across the basement stairway was just how unwelcoming it felt. It's not like the rest of the house was super welcoming or anything, but the basement in particular had this really off-putting feel. And I think a big part of this is the lighting. And this isn't just because there's very minimal lighting in the stairwell and the hallway, although that doesn't help it feel less scary, but it's the color of the light itself that plays a huge role. I think the game devs were definitely aware of the psychology behind certain lighting, and they used this knowledge to make the basement stairwell even more terrifying. The psychology of light basically shows how different lights can affect our mood, emotions, and overall mental well-being. Studies show that warm light tends to be more comforting and relaxing, which can foster social connections and positive emotions, whereas cool lighting tends to enhance alertness and concentration. So, when I think of warm light, the first thing that comes to my mind are the street lights where I grew up, and these were high-pressure sodium lights, which aren't the best for illuminating roads, but they're still really common because of the amount of light they produce compared to the little amount of energy they require. So they were really cost efficient before LED lights were a big thing. And a byproduct of this warm light creates a visual effect known as the nostalgic landscape that kind of has a comforting vibe. And I think you can really see the difference in mood just from these pictures of streetlights alone, comparing the high pressure sodium and LED lights. And so if we go back to RE7 as an example, this save room is bathed in this kind of warm light that's designed to make you feel more at ease and comfortable. And I know the save room theme also plays a huge part in this, but if you turn the background music down, you can still feel this kind of welcoming atmosphere just from the lighting and the color palette of the room. It just makes everything a little less creepy. But then, as soon as you leave the save room and walk towards the basement stairwell, you can see just how quickly the vibe shifts from relaxing to feeling on edge, literally on the edge of the staircase, staring down at this cold fluorescent light that illuminates just enough of the drab gray concrete walls and cold damp floor to indicate to the player that this next area is unlike anything you've seen so far, and that sense of the unknown is absolutely dreadful. The warm lighting and earth tones from the walls and wood floors in the upstairs section is a shockingly stark contrast to the cold, narrow, and unforgiving industrial feel of the basement. And the stairwell acts as a kind of gateway between these two worlds that contain horrors of both the familiar and the unknown. So this stairwell is actually a perfect example of what people call a liminal space. And I know this is a super popular buzzword now, especially with horror games, and it's maybe overanalyzed a bit, but I think it's important to consider here. In case you didn't know, liminality is a condition or space characterized by a transitionality, ambiguity, and potential transformation, which basically means it's a space of in-betweenness. And this can be a physical or metaphorical space. And train stations are a pretty literal example of liminal spaces, because you're in between your departure point and destination, or suspended in transit. But you can also think of liminal spaces as places that are in between states of existence, like an abandoned factory or an empty school at midnight. And these spaces can often seem surreal and make us feel uneasy because you're experiencing these places outside of their intended use or purpose. And it's no secret that liminal spaces are all over horror games, from Silent Hill to Exit 8 and the classrooms, for example. But what makes the liminal space of the RE7 basement staircase so creepy? It's not that the basement is overtly threatening, but it's the ambiguity of threat that makes us feel really creeped out. It would be one thing if the stairs were covered in blood, or the door was grotesque, or you could hear the molded having a party down there or something. That would show us that there's a real, tangible threat that we're about to face. But the staircase denies us that, and doesn't really give us any clear indication that there is a threat, or even what that threat might be. On the surface, it just seems like a rather plain staircase to an ordinary basement door, but the subtle clues around you say otherwise. The small patch of mold on the ground, the save room being right next to us, the cold ambiance of the fluorescent light, and all of the scary events prior leading up to this moment. You just know, however ambiguous the threat may be, this basement is not safe. This feeling in the game, coupled with our cultural and psychological aversion towards basements in general, makes this liminal space almost unbearable to go through. But go through it we must, and once we do, we leave all ambiguity behind and face the real threat behind the basement door. And it's really scary. Whenever I load up RE7, I never feel good when I get to this part of the game. I don't necessarily hate it, but I'm never like, when I get there. I always get the same feeling of panic and dread, and it's never fun, even on multiple playthroughs. But just because it's not fun doesn't mean it's not scary. In my opinion, the antidote to fear in horror games is frustration. The moment I start tilting at a horror game, any fear I had immediately disappears, and the only emotion I feel is rage. And this is a problem I have especially with playing horror games on harder difficulties. Like, I get so annoyed when I keep dying by something and it just feels cheap and unfair, but the RE7 basement never really feels unfair to me. Sure, it's one of the more difficult sections of the game, especially on your first playthrough, but I always felt I could retreat back up the stairs if things got too dicey, and I could eventually build up the courage to go back down and try again. And having the save room right next to the basement also really helps mitigate a lot of this frustration. If a molded kills you, which happens a lot if you're me, you can always load your save back up and immediately try again. It just has that perfect balance of challenging gameplay and pure horror. And that's why, to me, this is the scariest part of Resident Evil 7. And the basement stairwell may be the creepiest area in the entire franchise. But I am curious how you all feel about the basement. If I missed anything that creeped you out, please let me know. And if you think I'm just over-exaggerating the whole thing and you think there are other scarier parts of the game, please let me know about that as well. And if you like videos like these where I break down specific parts of horror games, I will be making more, so you can subscribe if you want to see more horror game content like this. And I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.